She was not supposed to lose. When Cleopatra first moved toward Julius Caesar, Egypt still glittered with ancient power. Roman armies were tearing the Mediterranean apart, and half the world would soon know her name. But the real story of Cleopatra is not just a story of beauty, seduction, or doomed love. It is the story of a young queen born into a dying dynasty, trapped between empires, trying to outplay the most dangerous men in the world, and almost changing history. By the end, her kingdom would be broken, Rome would be transformed, and Cleopatra herself would become one of the most famous women who ever lived. But the legend buried the truth, because the real Cleopatra was sharper, harder, and far more dangerous than the myth that came after her. She was born in 69 BC into the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek royal house that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. Their capital, Alexandria, was one of the greatest cities on earth, rich with trade, learning, and royal spectacle. But behind the gold, the dynasty was rotting. The Ptolemies were famous for court plots, family betrayals, purges, and civil war. Brothers married sisters. Sisters fought brothers. Children could inherit a crown and a death sentence at the same time, and over all of it, Rome was already looming. Cleopatra understood something many of her relatives had not. To rule Egypt, you could not act like a stranger sitting on an old throne. Ancient writers remembered her not mainly for beauty, but for presence, intelligence, and the force of her voice. She likely spoke several languages, and unlike earlier Ptolemies, she seems to have learned Egyptian itself. That mattered. It meant she could present herself not just as a Greek queen, but as a living pharaoh. She became co-ruler in 51 BC after the death of her father, Ptolemy XII. She was still very young, probably around 18. By dynastic custom, she ruled alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, whom she also had to marry. On paper, it was a partnership. In reality, it was the opening move of a war. Cleopatra tried to rule with unusual independence, and that alarmed the powerful men around her brother. Egypt was under pressure. The economy was strained. Rome was unstable. Every decision mattered. Soon Cleopatra was pushed out of Alexandria and forced into exile, while her brother's faction took control of the capital. For many rulers, that would have been the end. Cleopatra prepared to come back. Then Rome exploded. Julius Caesar and Pompey were at war for control of the Roman world. After defeating Pompey in 48 BC, Caesar pursued him toward Egypt. Pompey arrived first, hoping for help from the young king's court. Instead, Ptolemy XIII's advisors had him murdered, thinking Caesar would be pleased. It was a disastrous miscalculation. When Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's head, he was appalled. Now he found Egypt divided, unstable, and rich, exactly the kind of kingdom Rome could dominate. Cleopatra saw her chance. Shut out of the capital and facing defeat, she somehow got herself into Caesar's presence, bypassing her enemies and forcing a meeting. The famous story says she was smuggled in, wrapped in bedding. Whether every detail is true or not, the point is clear. Cleopatra reached Caesar when she needed him most, and once she had his attention, she changed the game. This was not a helpless queen begging for rescue. It was a political offer. Cleopatra understood what Caesar wanted: stability, money, influence, and a ruler in Egypt who would work with him. Caesar understood what Cleopatra offered: intelligence, legitimacy, and far more ability than the faction around her brother. Their relationship became personal, yes, but it was political from the beginning. Alexandria turned into a battlefield. Caesar suddenly found himself trapped in the city in the middle of a dynastic war. Fighting spread through the streets and around the harbor. Fires broke out. Reinforcements were called. Caesar had to fight simply to survive. For Cleopatra, the stakes were absolute. If Caesar lost, she would likely lose everything with him. But Caesar did not lose. By early 47 BC, Ptolemy XIII was dead, probably drowned while fleeing after defeat. Cleopatra was restored to power, officially alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. In practice, the balance had changed completely. She had survived exile, outmaneuvered her rivals, and attached herself to the strongest Roman alive. Soon she gave birth to a son, Caesarion. Cleopatra presented him as Caesar's child. However firmly Caesar acknowledged him in Roman terms is still debated, but politically the meaning was explosive. A queen of Egypt now had a son linked to Julius Caesar himself. Then she went to Rome. That was dangerous in ways that are easy to miss. Caesar was rising higher than any Roman was supposed to rise, and many already feared he was becoming a king in all but name. Cleopatra's presence sharpened that fear. To some Romans, she was fascinating. To others, she represented everything they hated: monarchy, Eastern luxury, personal power, and the possibility that Caesar's ambitions no longer ended at Rome's traditions. Then, in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated. The blow was immediate. Cleopatra had tied her position to the most powerful man in Rome, and now he lay dead on the Senate floor. She returned to Egypt. Ptolemy XIV soon disappeared from the scene, and Caesarion was elevated beside her as co-ruler. She had survived another collapse, but Rome was heading into even greater violence. After Caesar's death, power did not return to the Republic. It shattered into another struggle. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, crushed Caesar's assassins, and divided power among themselves. For Cleopatra, the question was now brutally simple. Which Roman would matter most, and how could Egypt survive him? The answer pulled her toward Mark Antony. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus. He needed resources, loyalty, and control in the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra knew the stakes. If she appeared weak, she could be controlled. If she appeared defiant, she could be destroyed. So she chose something else. She arrived like a queen who intended to overwhelm the room. Ancient writers filled this scene with gold, perfume, purple sails, and divine theater. The exact details may be exaggerated, but the essence is believable. Cleopatra staged power. She wanted Antony to see wealth, confidence, and irresistible political value. And Antony, unlike Caesar, was emotional, theatrical, and vulnerable to spectacle. Their alliance quickly became intimate. But again, politics came first. Antony needed Egypt's money and grain. Cleopatra needed Roman protection, dynastic security, and the return of territories that would strengthen her kingdom. Together, they gave each other what they could not secure alone. Over time, their relationship deepened, and Cleopatra bore Antony children as well. But this was never just romance floating above history. It was statecraft sharpened into partnership. For a time, it worked. Egypt remained wealthy and influential. Antony campaigned in the east. Cleopatra's position grew stronger. It may even have seemed, briefly, that they were building something durable. But in Rome, Octavian was watching. he understood that Antony's connection to Cleopatra could be turned into a weapon. Cleopatra became, in Octavian's story, not a monarch defending her dynasty, but a dangerous foreign queen corrupting a Roman leader. It was brilliant politics. If Octavian fought Antony alone, it looked like another Roman civil war. If he fought Cleopatra, he could make the conflict look like a defense of Rome itself. Then Antony made it easier. In the donations of Alexandria in 34 BC, he publicly granted eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children in an extravagant ceremony. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, and Caesarian status was raised in ways that sounded deeply alarming to Roman ears. In Alexandria, this may have looked like dynastic confidence. In Rome, it looked like betrayal. Octavian seized on it. By 32 BC, war was coming. Octavian fueled outrage with claims about Antony's will, including the idea that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria and was placing Cleopatra's family too close to Roman power. Whether every detail was presented honestly mattered less than the effect. Rome was being prepared for a final reckoning, and Cleopatra understood what losing would mean. This was no longer just about Antony's career. If Octavian won completely, Egypt would not remain an equal kingdom. Her children would be in danger. Her dynasty could be wiped away. The game she had played for years, balancing Rome while preserving the throne, was reaching its end. The decisive confrontation came in 31 BC at Actium. It was not simply a glorious clash of fleets. It was a tense, exhausting showdown shaped by bad positioning, pressure, disease, logistics, and command decisions. Antony and Cleopatra had enormous resources, but their situation was fragile. Octavian's side, directed at sea by Agrippa, was more disciplined and better placed. Then, in the middle of battle, Cleopatra's squadron broke through and sailed away. Antony followed. Why that happened is still argued over. Was it a planned breakout? A sudden recognition that the battle was lost? A desperate attempt to save what remained? Ancient hostile writers turned it into proof that Antony abandoned an empire for love. Reality was probably colder than that. Their position was collapsing, and they were trying to salvage survival from disaster. But whatever the motive, the result was devastating. Actium broke their cause. After that, everything narrowed. They fled back to Egypt. Allies fell away. Confidence drained. Octavian advanced. Still, Cleopatra did not surrender at once. She prepared defenses, sought negotiations, and tried to protect the future of her children, especially Caesarion. Even at the edge of ruin, she was still calculating. Antony was breaking under the weight of failure. In 30 BC, Octavian invaded Egypt, and the final collapse came quickly. What followed is one of the most tragic endings in ancient history, and one of the most misunderstood. As Octavian closed in on Alexandria, Antony received false or confused news that Cleopatra was dead. Despairing, he fell on his sword. It was not the clean, heroic death of legend. He did not die immediately. He was reportedly carried to Cleopatra and died in her presence, a shattered warlord in the last refuge of a broken kingdom. Cleopatra was now alone with the winter approaching, and Octavian wanted her alive. That mattered. He did not need her merely dead. He wanted her captured, displayed, reduced to a trophy in his triumph at Rome. Cleopatra seems to have understood this almost instantly. She could negotiate, delay, and test possibilities. But if Octavian carried her through Rome in chains, her image and dignity would belong to him forever. So Cleopatra made her last decision. The exact method of her death remains uncertain. The famous story is the ASP, the hidden snake, the royal bite. But ancient accounts were already divided, and poison by other means is also possible. What is clear is that in August 30 BC, Cleopatra died before Octavian could parade her through Rome. She was around 39 years old. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty effectively ended. Caesarion was soon captured and killed. Cleopatra's children by Antony were taken into Roman control. Egypt, once a kingdom balancing on the edge of empire, became a possession of Octavian. Its wealth would help finance the new Roman age he was building. And that may be the deepest irony of Cleopatra's life. She is often remembered as the woman who distracted great men, or the queen whose romances destroyed her. But the real Cleopatra was fighting a far larger battle than that. She was trying to keep Egypt independent when independence was already slipping out of reach. She faced Caesar, civil war, assassination, Antony, Octavian's propaganda, and the machine that would become the Roman Empire. She did not simply drift through those storms. She acted inside them, aggressively and intelligently, with enormous personal risk. Did she make mistakes? Absolutely. Her fate became tied to Roman strongmen because Egypt had reached a moment where ignoring Rome was impossible. Her alliance with Antony handed Octavian the propaganda he wanted. Actium was disastrous. But reducing her story to vanity or seduction misses almost everything that made her formidable. She was a ruler who understood performance as power, a politician who knew symbols could move armies, a queen who could speak to different worlds at once: Greek, Egyptian, Roman, divine, royal, practical. She used motherhood politically, staged her appearances with precision, navigated exile, survived coups, and held her throne for 2 decades in one of the most dangerous eras imaginable. Even after death, she was turned into a weapon. Roman writers, shaped by Augustus's victory, had every reason to make Cleopatra look like the corrupting outsider who deserved defeat. Later centuries added their own fantasies. The result was a legend so powerful that it almost erased the woman underneath it. But the real Cleopatra still stands there, if you look closely enough. Not just the queen who loved Caesar and Antony, but the last ruler of an ancient kingdom, fighting the rise of Rome with everything she had. And when defeat finally came, denying her conqueror the ending he wanted most,